my gosh. All right, do I have a movie for you? This is House, or in the original Japanese title, Hausu. It's a movie that came out in 1977 and is a supposed horror film, but I would better specify it as an experimental horror, something otherwise kind of film. So this movie is directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi, and this movie is just... it's different, guys. It's very different. Experimental is the key word here I'm trying to give you guys to kind of get you in the right frame of mind when you view this movie. But it is an experience, I promise you that. So what this movie is actually about is we follow a group of girls who are on a vacation, and the main character is named Gorgeous. Yes, Gorgeous. And we'll get to that in a second. She's going to go and vacation with her aunt, who's kind of estranged and living alone in a mansion, out in the middle of nowhere. And so she invites her other friends along, who are all named after, well, stereotypical traits. Kind of like an 80s, token troupe of some sorts. You got the fat one, who's named Mac. You get it? Big Mac. Huh. And you also have Sweet, who's the sweetest thing. You have Fantasy, who's always daydreaming. You have Kung Fu, because action scenes. And you have Prof, short for Professor, because she's the academic one. And Melody, who enjoys her music. I mean, you gotta appreciate a film that's pretty upfront about some of its priorities here, So these girls do journey out to this estranged aunt in the middle of nowhere in her mansion. We do get some backstory that she lost her husband during World War II and that she's been alone ever since. I guess waiting for him or something, but it's pretty clear early on that there's some strange happenings going on around the house that leads to death, mayhem, and some pretty far out there visual effects. And what winds up happening is that the house, through sort of some kind of magical properties, starts consuming these girls one by one in very strange and creative ways. The first thing I'm going to talk about, despite how horrific that plot sounds, this movie is surprisingly upbeat. Yeah, just the music alone kind of establishes the sort of slice of life kind of anime show, which if you know the kind, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not really familiar with anime from the 70s or before that, but if it's anything like anime shows from the 80s on, there's a pattern here about the type of humor, pacing, and even the way the music sounds in a lot of these types of anime shows. Surprisingly, despite it being live action, there is almost a sort of humor and silliness to the overall tone. And I guess you could take that as sort of a good and a bad thing. At the very least, it's unique. The one problem with that, though, is that the tone kind of gets in the way of this being a full-on horror experience. Because if you were expecting a scary movie, well, our characters kind of act too much like cartoon characters in order to, well, have this be a full-on scary experience. Which might disappoint some, but like I said, you're still in for a treat here. So the other wacky thing about the movie is that it has some really bizarre editing techniques all throughout the film. And a lot of these filmmaking techniques actually work pretty well and others not so much. So for example, when we learn the backstory of the auntie and kind of see this flashback of her husband and going to war, it's all done in sepia tone, you kind of seen that before, but it's all done within the frame of a film strip that's being animated from the sides, which I thought was kind of a clever idea. And you see a lot of special effects that are very fake looking, but it seems to be somewhat intentional. Like I said, there's a clear style going on in this film. But on the flip side though, there's a lot of techniques that don't work all that well. So for example, sometimes how you see a medium wide shot, you see characters talking, and then you'll cut to a close-up so that you can see that character's face up close as they're talking. Well, they decided to merge the two shots together by, taking the close-up and masking it with a feathered edge and then just overlapping it right on top of the medium wide shot. It's awkward and doesn't look great, and unfortunately they kind of do that a few times throughout the film. They also do a lot of chroma keying, even when it doesn't seem to really be appropriate. The chroma keying doesn't always work all that well. Sometimes you can see disappearing pixels within a character, or even see some of the blue screen on the edges while they're moving. But I guess to be fair, this is an ongoing issue even for later films. I mean, you can see some chroma keying issues with Stay Puft and Ghostbusters. Yeah, try unseeing that. And then probably the biggest sin is that, you do have that character named Kung Fu who basically kind of jumps into action, and you have this silly martial arts theme that plays while she's in action, and the editing is so quick and sloppy that sometimes you can tell when her action happens, there's supposed to be some kind of humor to it, kind of like how you see in those anime shows, but it goes so quick and so sloppy that it kind of goes over your head. And unfortunately, that's a lot of this film. And including the main characters, you hear a lot of chatting going on throughout the film, sometimes to the point where it's distracting from the scene. You can't really hear or understand exactly what's being said or what's really important for the scene. Yeah, it just kind of gets noisy after a while when these characters just constantly talk. But you also have techniques like sort of like these comic book action lines that they animate into the frame. There's some really cool examples of it, and then some that are very 70s, if you catch my drift. But what might be attributing to that a little bit is that most of these actresses were inexperienced at the time that they played these roles. There is sort of a strange story to the production of this film. So back in the day, Toho is the production company and distributor, and they were having a hard time with their films at the time, losing money, so they decided to take a gamble on the director. And one of the inspirations for the plot is, well, from the director's daughter. Because he had this philosophy that children have a way of like expressing things that don't 100% make sense, and he wanted to capture that on screen. And I mean, I think he did a pretty good job in that regard. The film is not fully comprehensible. I mean, there is a beginning, middle, and end, but there's a lot of scenes that do seem kind of random. Like when the girls are on their way to the mansion, they do run into this watermelon salesman who's just unusually strange, you know, like a creepy old cartoon character. Like he's trying to give them that foreboding warning of what's to come. The other character of note is a cat named Blanche. Or at least that's what it says in the subtitles, but the characters always call him Shiro. This cat is established as having some kind of magical property to it, because when his eyes twinkle, something bad always happens. And there's a lot of memorable scenes in this movie. I mean, I can only just mention a handful without giving too much away, but we have this flying decapitating head. We have a piano that eats somebody, sort of in the same vein as Mario 64, but way more dismemberment. And we have a giant head coming in, and then we have someone who's cut into pieces, but then still like flying kicks at a portrait that spews blood everywhere. There's so much craziness going on in this movie. It's absolute insanity, and that's why this movie is absolutely worth a viewing. Funny enough, this is almost like a Japanese Evil Dead in the same vein that there's not a lot of logic to the supernatural happenings. Like anything can happen, sort of like an ongoing nightmare. But yeah, the tone and the plot clash so much that even IndieWire had said this was the cheeriest and most infectious bloodbath in cinematic history. And that should give you an idea of what you're in for. But there's honestly a lot of small details I have not even included in this review, and if you want to go see them, definitely go check out this movie. So it's difficult to rate a movie like this, because on one hand, this is a very unique and unusual film, and it's being talked about decades after, which should say something about its legacy. But at the same time, if this movie were to come out nowadays, it would not be tolerated whatsoever. There's a lot of faults, there's a lot of technical issues, and its merit is not enough to overcome that nowadays. So is it worth watching? I think most audiences would not really care for it all that much. Like I said, it is a little bit of nonsense and not fully comprehensible, but at the same time though, there is a really fun horror plot happening here and a lot of crazy special effects and experimentation going on with the filmmaking. As you can well imagine, college students would absolutely love this film to death. And so when I score this film, keep in mind, scores don't really matter by the end of the day. I'm just going by my own personal system. So Hausu gets my score of 2.5 stars. That's not necessarily a bad score. Honestly, there's a lot of films out there that clearly have a lot of effort, a lot of love in them, but aren't technically great films. They're kind of bad, they have a lot of flaws, but there's something worth talking about them after many, many years. Kind of like my review of Dune, the original Dune from the 1980s. It's a movie that has a lot of flaws, but it's so epic and clearly has so much effort in it, it's worth talking about even decades later. And Hausu is really similar in the same vein. So, wow. Guys, thanks so much for watching. Have you all seen Hausu? And if not, what else have you been watching lately? Comment below, let me know, and stay tuned right here if you all want to see more.